In the last episode of Articulating the Art of Bengal, 1750 to 1947, we had discussed the Bengal School, dissected its creative core, and studied its influence, especially through the artworks of Abanindranath Tagore. We also heard from experts how, during the same period, counter discourses were championed by the likes of Hemendranath Majumdar and Atul Bose. In this episode, Santiniketan School 1928 to 1947, interestingly, we would be tracing both the continuities and the disconnects of the Bengal School in the emergent art practice of the 20th Santiniketan, which, as you will soon witness, preached and practiced context-sensitive modernism instead of glorifying the past to counter Western modernism. Since Rabindranath did not completely subscribe to Abanindranath's vision for Indian art, we would also try to understand why then Abanindranath's protege, Nandalal Bose, was put in charge of the newly founded art institution in Shantiniketan. The other stalwarts of the Shantiniketan school were Binod Bihari Mukherjee and Ramkinkar Baij. We would learn more about the innovative ideas and techniques that were introduced by these Santiniketan artists to engage with the world and portray it creatively. Most importantly, though, this session will further shed light on how these artists stood apart yet together in the making of a contextual modernism in Shantiniketan. Where did they diverge and why, and how then did they converge and meet again? Discussing these and many such intriguing questions today are Professor R. Siva Kumar and Professor Soumik Nandy Majumdar. Professor R. Siva Kumar has worked extensively on the Shantiniketan artists and has been teaching art history at Kalabhavan Vishwabharati for the last 40 years. He has curated major national and international exhibitions highlighting the contribution of the Shantiniketan artists. Joining him today is Professor Soumik Nandy Majumdar, who is an art historian, art critic, and curator. Professor Majumdar also teaches art history at Kalabhavan and has made a significant contribution to the discourse through his lucid Bengali and English essays. So, without further ado, over to Professor Majumdar.
To begin with, and when we are talking about Shantiniketan and particularly Kalabhavan as a school of art and as a very significant milestone in the history of modern Indian art, can we start with something, an idea or a conception or a preconception, you can say, and probably little misconceived, that Shantiniketan is an extension of Bengal School. But we all know that this is perhaps not true. So, can we begin by talking about how to understand Shantiniketan as a center of modern art and as a distinctive center of modern art, and why it is better that we don't consider that as an extension of Bengal School and look at the significant points of departure. So, how do we look at that?
Some of us have been trying to argue this, but I still think this has not been fully recognized or appreciated. Now, there are certain reasons for this, of course. I mean, Nandalal was trained under Abanindranath, and Nandalal always talked about Abanindranath as his guru. So obviously, people construe a continuity. And the artists of these two places intermingled a great deal. So they look too much on the continuities and they don't focus on the shifts or changes. Now, one way of really bringing this change into focus, I think, is a very simple image that we have. The tree that we have at the center of Kalabon, which is sometimes referred to as the China bot.
Yeah.
That tree is supposed to have been a bonsai gifted by Abanindranath. Now, Nandalal replanted the tree, and as you all know, that it has grown into a wonderful tree, which is now large, which dominates the scene, which kind of sheds its leaves every year, and it kind of comes back to life within a couple of days, and it gives you a sense of re-enchantment. Now, that tree sort of symbolizes, in a way, the shift from the Bengal school to Shantiniketan. If Bengal school was an excellent example of the art of bonsai, Shantiniketan is the act of reconnecting it back to nature, back to life, and allowing it to grow. Now, this shift would not have happened without Rabindranath's intervention. Now, he, while appreciating what Rabindranath was doing, also saw the shortcomings of that kind of an art. He realized that an art which is too concerned with the past and not equally concerned with the present, would not take India very far. And this is something that he wanted to do. And also, he wanted art to connect with both the, the physical and cultural environment in which you are living and to the times in which you are living. And he thought that this was not happening in good measure in Bengal school. And therefore, he wanted to start this new place in Shantiniketan where these things could happen. And I think that is the main idea behind Shantiniketan. And in a sense, I think he made the right choice of people. Of the people who were then available to him, Nandalal certainly was the most suitable to undertake such a job. He was by temperament, I mean, somebody who related to nature. He was by temperament somebody who was interested in a more monumental kind of art. And I think Rabindranath made the right choice. So both these things are very important. And I think also that when you look back, you can see that Shantiniketan was a, departure not only from the Bengal school, but it was also a departure from the kind of academic art training that was there, the colonial art. So it was a departure from both these things. And I think it is this departure that needs to be recognized rather than the continuity.
And this is also true that despite his departure from both, as you said, the colonial art uh, training, colonial art atmosphere, as well as Bengal school, despite this, we have also seen that some of the artists in Shantiniketan have kind of continued to follow somewhat the Bengal school style or certain mannerism almost throughout their life. Therefore, the shift we are talking about, the departure we are talking about, can this be understood really as a total departure, or we can see certain overlaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, there will be overlaps because, as I said, that there was always a traffic of people between these two schools. It's not that as if, I mean, uh, Shantiniketan and the artists of the Bengal school didn't communicate. They did, and there were many of them were personal friends. So while we talk about these two schools, we are talking in terms of aggregates. Let's look at the Bengal school itself. Abanindranath himself evolved and didn't stick to the principles of the Bengal school. After a while, okay. And then you have within that Bengal school, you have Venkatappa, you have various other people. Who didn't completely stick to the ideals of the Bengal school, okay. But there was a large body of artists who stuck to that, so that creates the identity. Similarly, in Shantiniketan, there were people who moved away from the the ideals in such a way from, in one direction or the other. take somebody for Ashit Kumar Haldar, who was trained under Abhinandannath, in the sense belonged to the Bengal school. Although he came and taught here, he didn't shift as much as Nandalal did from those ideals. Okay, and for instance, his love for the mythological and historical continuity. There were also other students who were trained by Nandalal who also carried forward some of those things. Now, so we find overlaps, or maybe say someone like Raman Chakravarti was trained here, but eventually, because he was a graphic artist and was, I mean, you moved more towards the Western naturalistic thing. So, in a sense, to the colonial art education. So, it is not like a monolithic thing, but definitely there were a good number of people and very important artists like Binod Bihari, Ram Kinkar, Nandalal himself, Rabindranath, and many others who really demonstrate a very clear shift. And therefore, when we say that, I mean, they belong to two different things, it doesn't necessarily mean that there was no overlap. There will be some overlap. In fact, I mean, in the Trivandrum Museum, where I used to spend a lot of time when I was a boy, there is a wing devoted to Ravi Verma, and there's a wing devoted to the Bengal School. It has a beautiful collection, wonderful collection of Bengal School, including Santiniketan artists. I mean, both Santiniketan, but Santiniketan is less represented, Bengal School is more represented. And what happens, you can think of Ravi Verma and Abhinandannath, poles apart. But when you walk through the galleries, you see there are some place where their followers, students, they look very close. So when we think about these differences, it doesn't mean that the differences are spreading equally across every artist. But you see there are poles apart, but then the followers, the kind of thing, come closer somewhere. Then there is a kind of intermixture that happens. So that intermixture was there certainly. But in terms of ideals, there was a clear departure.
And just before we move on and talk about Nondula, just if you allow me to say quickly that while you're talking about artists trained under Abanindranath and kind of finding out, uh, find it out some path, some a kind of solution perhaps to their dilemma, or they were making certain choices despite the fact some of them did come to Shantiniketan. I'm suddenly reminded of a curious artist, though he comes from a slightly later stage, that is Prashanth Roy. Trained under Abanindranath, spent a lot of time in Shantiniketan, and he neither actually completely gave up Bengal school, nor did he adopt the Shantiniketan, but he went for a curious derivative language with lot of genuine and interesting inputs. So this was also a possible way how an artist like Prashanth Roy was negotiating the various inspirations. Um, and of course, he was also pretty close to Nondula at that point of time.
Yeah, that's what I said. There would be people who are close to each other, who are kind of personal friends, but in terms of ideals and ideas, might be poles apart. Now, Prashant Roy was, in my eyes, an extremely, I mean, talented person in the sense, I mean, he had a lot of skills, but then he was trying to negotiate with between two slightly opposite attitudes. I mean, he took elements, or sometimes he worked under the shadow of Abanindranath, sometimes under the shadow of Gaganendranath. Now, these are two different visions of art. Now, so he didn't try to kind of amalgamate and create something of his own. And I think he put a little too emphasis on the look of art rather than on the soul, the spirit, the conceptual underpinnings. And so you will have a lot of artists who are sometimes extremely skilled, who can carry the vocabulary of the masters, but without developing a perspective of their own, in a sense. Now, and in that case, your ability to steer the art of the next generation in a new direction gets compromised. And this is where Nandalal, compared to all the other students of Abanindranath, succeeds. And I think this is also where Kalabhavan and Shantiniketan becomes a very important center in the growth of modern Indian art.
And so coming to Nondula, since you mentioned Nondula as one of the most successful students of Abanindranath, who kind of steered the future generation into a new direction instead of simply following the masters. And we have seen his results, some of the most brilliant results like Ram Kinkar and Vinod Bihari, who despite being very close to their mentor Nondulal, never actually followed him to or kind of exactly imitated him. So coming back to Nondulal, and to see Nondulal as someone who took charge of, as you have already mentioned, of Kalabhavan right from the beginning. He was leading Kalabhavan as an institution, and also the art atmosphere of the place in many ways, as we all know. So his role as a teacher artist, it's so intertwined that when we talk about Nondula, it is often more than difficult to segregate or separate Nondulal's role as a teacher from Nondulal's role as an artist. It seems they're almost kind of integral to each other in more than one ways, because his pedagogical uh, engagement as a teacher of Kalabhavan and his persona as an artist are so um, overlapping one with the other. So that must have left a huge impression on his students and succeeding students also, succeeding students from the following generations also. And Nondula, we also know, was the one, as you have already mentioned, he was gradually a changing person after he reached Shantiniketan. In the sense, he must have got all those predilections and inclinations before, which Rabindranath Tagore surely have noticed, and that is the reason he was asked to come and join Kalabhavan. But at the same time, the way he began responding to the immediate environment, both natural and social, responding to the craft of making art, including mediums, materials, etc. To what extent, Shivda, do you think that actually contributed to the construction of not exactly a language, but construction of new ways of looking at art practice altogether?
Um, well, see, one of the things, I think one have to go back in some sense to Rabindranath. Rabindranath was, as I suggested, doing the nudging. I mean, he was putting ideals before people, uh, connecting with nature, connecting with, your immediate reality, and connecting with the issues that India faced as a emerging, I mean, a nation struggling against colonialism. Now, all these are part of that reality. And he wanted art to come out of the studio and also connect with people. And he also wanted art to be thought about in a larger perspective, going beyond the individual creativity and expression of the artist. Now, this was something that Nandalal probably took as his brief as a teacher, and then he devised ways. Rabindranath didn't say, how would you go about it? He said, well, these things would change art. And it was left to Nandalal to devise ways, a kind of art program, a kind of teaching program by which, these could be achieved. So Nandalal brought in study of nature, okay, which was not part of Abanindranath's method of teaching. Abanindranath never took his students outside. It was always interaction within the studio space. He told them about past art. He got people to introduce them to ancient literature and so on and so forth, and encourage them to be imaginative. But in Shantiniketan, right from the beginning, Nandalal took them out to draw from nature, which incidentally we know that Ashit Kumar didn't do. Although they were at the same time, we know from Binod Bihari that Ashit Kumar followed Abanindranath's method of teaching in the studio, whereas Nandalal took the students out and really introduced them to drawing from nature. Now, that is one thing that comes. The second thing, that while Abanindranath was not very keen on monumental art, public art, Nandalal from the very beginning was very keen about that. He took an interest in Ajanta much before other people. And when the Bengal School took an interest in Ajanta, it was for the mannerisms of drawing, of putting the figure, etc. But Nandalal's interest was more in what all Ajanta mixed together, that it brought in narration, it brought in, kind of decoration, it brought in kind of various ways of moving from one to the other. These were very important for him. So, bringing in all these different aspects of art or different kinds of art together within one kind of expression, that was interesting to Nandalal. So, you can see the difference. So, maybe in certain paintings of Nandalal, you might see an Ajanta like stylization, but on the large, that is not what he took from Ajanta. Okay, so Nandalal's approach was different. Similarly, in terms of, so you saw drawing from nature, uh, looking at past traditions to learn not their styles, but the conceptual underpinnings of these art, and he explained them to his students. And then, if you thinking in terms of art as almost visual culture, as part of a visual culture, that there's no difference between arts and crafts bringing together. Now, this was something that Rabindranath experienced in Japan, okay? And he writes about it, that the arts and crafts mingle, every aspect of life has the same aesthetic ideals running through them, and so on. Nandalal tried to put those ideals into practice. So, in a sense, they work like a team. Rabindranath probably did the nudging, the conceptual kind of suggestions, and Nandalal was a resourceful artist and he was probably temperamentally geared to doing that. So he really put this kind of art, I mean, on the in front of the Indian art practice. And that was what changed Shantiniketan, because I don't think there is another school at that time, certainly, which had such a perspective. Today, all this might be very common, to draw from life, draw from nature, go out and look at things. Doing kind of monumental art, putting public art, all this is very common today, or trying to cross boundaries between art forms, etc. But in the beginning of the 20th century, this was very unusual, this was new. And I think that distinguished his approach to art teaching and art practice.
In fact, while we are discussing Nondula and his role as a teacher, we also should remember that he left a good amount of written material written by him, compiled a decade back as Drishti or Srishti, Vision and Creation, and basically a combination of two books, Shilpokatha and Shilpocharcha, speaking of art and art practice. Now, I just chanced upon one small paragraph, a very well known paragraph, um, very lucidly written in one of the chapters, that is Ways of Seeing, in Shilpokatha, it is speaking of art, and that exactly substantiates what you were talking about when you said that Nandalal would take his students out from the studio and make them respond to nature. So therefore, he writes that when a student has been asked to study the Bonopulok tree, a lovely tree in Shantiniketan, and he's being told how to. Now, let us listen to the procedure of looking at a tree as proposed by Nandalal. Nandalal says, watch the tree for some time, go and sit near it, morning, noon, evening, even in the darkness of night. That will not be easy. After sitting for a while, you will feel bored. You will feel that the tree is telling you in annoyance, what are you doing here? Go away, get lost. Then you will have to coax the tree and say, my teacher has asked me to. I cannot but heed him. Please don't be annoyed. Be nice to me. Show yourself out to me. If after a few days of such effort you feel you are seeing the tree, then go home, close yourself up and paint that tree. I quote close. So, Shibda, this is very evident from this small passage that nonetheless, whereas on the one hand, he wants his students to go out and respond to nature, on the other hand, he is not necessarily insisting on the practice of drawing a tree immediately out there. Rather, he is insisting on building up a memory capacity, a visual memory, in other words. So, how do you respond to this, Shraddha?
Yeah, you're right, Shomik. Actually, uh, there were two aspects to this study from nature. He, as you suggested, asked them to go out, observe, and maybe make drawings. But also, he emphasized on coming back and drawing what you have seen or what you have drawn from life, redrawing those things from memory. So, this was a process of internalizing. And secondly, what happens is that you shed the the kind of over detailing kind of that you can do when you're in front of an object, and you can go back to the essentials, and while doing that, your movement of hand as an artist, for instance, what you might call your innate motor actions, I mean, would come. So it is not just looking, like it becomes like walking. We have the same kind of anatomy, but all of us walk a little differently. We have our little, let us call it mannerism, but it's not just mannerism, but expressions. And that comes from our mind and our body. And when you are drawing as an artist, you are not only working with your eyes and your mind, but you are also working with your body. So these two different kinds of drawing allowed both these aspects to grow together. Now, if you don't observe and if you just draw from memory, then your connect with the world is too tenuous. But if you only draw from the object, the connect with your mind and your body will be somewhat constrained. So he wanted to free up all this so you really intuitively learn how to coordinate all these aspects. So I think that was very important for Nandalals.
So it's not surprising that in the previous chapter of the same book, he makes a very pertinent statement here when Nondula says, the special virtue of visual art is to transform one visible object into another kind of visible object. So, Shibda, clearly he's talking about a transformation, not imitation of nature. And this again is reflected what we just said now. And in the same paragraph, Nandalal writes, a visual artist aspires to evoke in his painted image of a flower the qualities of its delicate touch and fragrance. So it's interesting that how does one evoke fragrance of a flower in an image of a flower, which is after all a visual. So this is exactly what you're trying to say, Shibda, that he's trying to connect different sensibilities, not just visual, and therefore introducing an alternative practice of learning art. And along with that, I would also like to emphasize, and maybe I'll ask you also to respond on that, that why did Nandulal, who was primarily not a writer, but definitely a thinker, a deep thinker, and primarily a hands on artist, would actually spend time on writing two major volumes on art. When later on we will talk about Vinod Bihari, we will definitely see that as an intellectual person, probably for Vinod Bihari, it was quite natural to write. But what do you think about Nandalal as a writer?
You know, at that point of time, all these artists, not just Nandalal, Abhinendranath, Rabindranath, Binod Bihari, they all thought that you should not be just practicing your art, but also making clear to oneself and to others what are the conceptual underpinnings of one's practice. Now, they all wrote on the one hand to make this clear to themselves, to articulate so that they know only when you articulate, you encounter those things. So they were not happy that these remain at a pure intuitive level. You can do that intuitively, you understand things, you practice it without maybe trying to analyze it, but they were not happy with that. And they all did various things. For instance, Abhinendranath wrote different kinds of things, and you can see his writing actually reflects the changes that come in his perception of what art is or art should be. So his early writings, like the Shatanga and so on, is of one kind, and his writings of the Bhageshwari are of different kind. Abhinendranath in the early one writes a manual kind of a thing. In the later one, he writes a kind of broad, conceptual, philosophical kind of a statement of what art practice should be, what should be the values that an artist pursues. In the case of Nandalal, Nandalal's understanding of art teaching was a little different from Abhinendranath's. While he valued the kind of freedom that Abhinendranath stressed on, he wanted his students to be resourceful and he wanted his students to be introduced to a whole spectrum of art practices, the underlying technical resources that you can draw from those practices. And so, therefore, he wrote the two books with two different purposes. One was again a technical manual, which would be useful for young artists who know how to work with different techniques, how to go about it, materials, etc., so on. And the other thing was uh, that what are the aesthetic, the social, the even in a sense a philosophical kind of underpinnings that this kind of a practice that Nandalal was trying to put forward, I mean, implied. And this is the second book. So these two books really give you two different things. Okay. And if you look at the practice book, the manual kind of a thing, there too we can see that he is not just uh, telling you what are the techniques. Okay, you put so much sand, you mix with so much lime, then you put it on the wall. No, that's not the kind of thing. He will tell you how do you stand, how do you sit, how do you hold the pencil, how do you do various things. So it is not just the materials and the techniques, it is the whole process of painting. Now, what does this imply? He says that everything an artist does contributes to the final image. So, if you sit down in a certain way and hold your pencil or brush in a certain way, then you can only move your hand in a certain way. So, that determines the image you can make. So, there is a continuity from the techniques and materials and the very simple physical facts which condition the making to the final image. Now, this is where Nandalal's books of techniques, or what we call manual or whatever techniques, it is so different from any other book you can get. I mean, you go across the world, you get there are many manuals, but nothing that connects the process with the image as Nandalal does. So he doesn't explain all these things, but to a sensitive reader, this is all very evident. Now, this is also true about Rabindranath and Binod Bihari. Rabindranath's early writings are full of, I mean, a philosophical concept of art. But his later writings, when he begins to be more involved with art and personally paint, they are most related to the physical experience of art and the problems an artist faces and how does he try to answer those issues as an artist. That comes forward. So, really, you can see that there is a big difference between, I mean, the early and the later writings of these people, or even with Binod Bihari. So you have, these are artists who were involved in articulating or finding for themselves first what are the frameworks of their practice, and then making those frameworks clear to their viewers, to their kind of students, and so on.
But as far as Binod Bihar is concerned, there are many writings by him which are not necessarily for this purpose of creating frameworks for his work. He is writing more like an independent art historian or art writer. And also, uh, it is needless to say that he's one of the most illustrious students of Nondula. And so, can we talk a little bit about Binod Bihari, both as a writer and as an artist? Yeah.
Certainly, I mean, you know, Nandalal, just like Rabindranath was very important, Nandalal was also very important for all these other artists who came after him. Now, there are two things that, I mean, that we ought to remember. And I mean, interestingly, I mean, Binod Bihari himself says this. He says that Nandalal didn't shepherd us in the same direction as students. He allowed each one of us to grow like a tree, a different kind of tree in a common landscape. So he says that all his classmates, they all worked in different ways, in a different kind of thing, and he gave them the freedom. So this metaphor is very interesting of having so many different trees growing in the same landscape. So that is something very important. So he didn't write exactly like Nandalal did. His purposes were different. Now, Nandalal, having done all those technical things, it was not necessary for him to do that again. And he did pay attention to the craft of painting. But Nandalal had already done that and he had already written about it. So he didn't go, I mean, about it in the same way. He talked about the underlying aesthetics of the kind of practice he was doing. That's one part. And therefore, there is that autobiographical overlap for that writing. And the other kind of writing that he did was, as you rightly suggested, was more like that of an art historian. Now, in fact, if you look at Indian writing on art, he was the first Indian to write in that manner about modern Indian art. There was nobody else. Of course, in this case, he, I do believe, was inspired by Stella Cranbridge, who was a trained art historian. Havel, Kumaraswamy, Nivedita, etc., who wrote about art, none of them were trained art historians. So when Cranbridge came to Santiniketan, he attended all her lectures and he knew or learned from her way of working how a trained art historian worked. And he really brings those aspects of art historical uh, kind of complexity into his writing, whether it is when he's talking about Abanindranath or Nandalal or Rabindranath or his contemporaries. You see this happening. So he tried to look, where do these forms or these particular styles originate? What does it kind of tell about the artist and the culture to us, and so on. And I think there are passages in his writing which can be compared to some of the finest art historical writings anywhere. So he certainly did a different kind of writing.
How did, or to what extent, Shivda, can we understand Vinod Behari? I mean, his art historian self is influencing Vinod Behari, the artist, or we need to look at them as two separate entities.
You are absolutely right in a sense that these artists, although they lived and shared many things, they looked at the world through their individual perspectives. Through Binod Bihari, more than anyone else, looked at the world through his own sensibilities. I mean, of course, so did Ramkinkar, Rabindranath, etc. Now, if you look at Indian art, around 1930, there are very few artists who are thinking about, their subjectivity or shaping their subjectivity through their art practice as much as Binod Bihari did. And you can see this especially in the way he looks at landscape. I mean, Nandalal, Binod Bihari, Ramkinkar, Rabindranath, they are all looking at the same landscape. They are representing their experiences of the landscape of Shantiniketan. And none of them actually look like the other in some sense. In Binod Bihari's case, he spent a lot of time, lot more energy studying nature and representing nature. Until about 1940, nature was his primary subject matter. Okay? And he does that in a sense even more than Nandalal. But when you look at his paintings, we wonder this vastness, the sense of loneliness, the ruggedness. Does it belong to Shantiniketan and its landscape, or does it belong to Binod Bihari? When you look at Ramkinkar, you see the sprightliness, the little things in the landscape which seems to be kind of springing up with full energy. Now, does it belong to the landscape or to Ramkinkar? The kind of close observation that you see, and as you suggested, almost that personal sensory experience, multi-sensory experience that you see in Nandalal's drawing. You can look at a tree trunk and you can almost feel the roughness of the trunk. You can look at a landscape and you can feel the dryness of summer. Now, these things, or look at a moonlit night and feel the kind of, softness and the coldness of the light. Now, all this kind of thing make them very, very separate kind of artists. They don't repeat each other. They look at the same nature, but they look at the same nature through different eyes. And these eyes are all very special. And even Rabindranath, the kind of color you see in his work, the kind of silhouettes and shapes and the ominousness of that shapes, you don't see in the work of any of these three other artists. So they lived in an environment, they had the same concerns, but they also looked at this world through very different eyes. And that is, I think, which sometimes we miss. Sometimes, if you look too much on the difference, you say, oh, they were also different. What is there about Shantiniketan? And if you don't look at those differences, you say, oh, Shantiniketan was a one kind of thing and it was all the same thing.
Of course, monotony is, I mean, it's not a monolithic school at all. And, but yes, Shivda, this is very interesting the way you said that everybody was looking through their own eyes. That is one thing. And it is also true, since these artists we are talking about, including Nandalal, Rabindranath, Ramkinkar, Vinod Bihari, and perhaps many others, who not only looked through their own eyes, but they had to shape their look or eyes in terms of a compatible visual language. So, otherwise, as you have already said, with reference to another artist, it might get stuck to a look or appearance, but not reach the conceptual underpinning or the structure of a visual language. So, can we quickly kind of say a few words, discuss a few things about each of these artists? How did they shape their look in terms of a compatible visual language?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. I think that is what distinguishes the Shantiyan artist in a sense that they didn't just think about what they wanted to paint, but they also thought a lot about visual language. Nandalal, again, was somebody who was very seriously concerned about it. So, as I suggested in his book on techniques, he's also explaining not only what are the material ingredients and what are the processes, stages, etc., but he's telling that how do you sit, how do you do hold the brush, how do you move the hand, and so on. So basically, it is a total system that they are talking about, and the system is always related to what that system makes possible. Like every language allows you to say some things and doesn't allow you to say some other things. So this is something that Nandalal realized. That is why he's sitting down and analyzing a great deal of visual languages, especially Asian languages. He looks at Egyptian art, he looks at Indian miniatures, Indian sculptures, Japanese screens, and so on and so forth. So why does he do that? Because each one allows you to do something. It has a possibility, and each one is distinct from the other. So he wanted to demonstrate that to all his students. And Nandalal actually experimented with them. If you look at his works around 1920s, you can see the Egyptian, the miniature, the Japanese screen, etc., all reflected. Now, sometimes people say that he was working in too many styles. But it was also part of his pedagogic thing to show this is what we can do with this language, this is what you do. But at the same time, there was Nandalal, the man behind it. We can look at it. Now, multiple styles doesn't mean that man is lost. Okay, look at Picasso. So many styles. But all through all that, you can see there is Picasso coming through all that. So Nandalal as a man was probably not somebody who wanted to push himself into the foreground, but he wanted to allow his materials, his language to speak for him. And whereas Binod Bihari or Ram Kinkar wanted to kind of really also see that they come through more strongly through the language. So they selected things that would allow them to do that, and so on. So, but Nandalal himself, you can see over a period of time, he changes. His early work was one kind. When it comes to Shantiniketan, there is more nature coming into his work. In the 20s, he is experimenting with these different kind of things, as I said. In the 30s, you can see all these various elements coming together in his work, where the environment really begins to be there. Appearing in his work in a very, very deeply felt manner. So you see that in the 30s, and you can see that he's also experimenting that bringing together of art and crafts, etc. The finest thing would be the Haripura posters. I mean, they are all based on folk styles, but they are not exactly repeating it. And you can see that what a consummate artist he was when you look at those posters. I mean, all the individuality we talk about is there in the way he handles it. And yet, the posters were not to be seen separately, but it was part of the architecture, of the temporary architecture made with bamboos and things like that. Okay, so basically, it had to fit into a world. So really, Haripura, unfortunately, it was not documented very clearly, but Haripura was a exercise in total designing, that where environment, art, everything came together. And he had, if it was only for a few weeks, he had the privilege of conceiving something like that. So it might be the kind of cohesive visual culture, let us say, of a Mughal court, taken and expanded in a rural context, maybe under the kind of patronage of Gandhi, not Akbar, but under the patronage of Gandhi. So, if you can think about a total art under the patronage of Gandhi, it would be like that. So, that is where Nandalal demonstrate, and people like Binod Bihari who were very sensitive to these aspects. He might have looked at the world through his own eyes, but he was also very sensitive to what Nandalal was doing. But being interested in nature, he obviously looked for artists who thought like him. And he found his compatriots not here, but in Japan and China. And he makes this very difficult journey. They hardly earned anything. So he saves and puts, scrapes together everything, and he goes to Japan and tries to travel to China to see these things. So they made this effort to educate themselves. And as I said, his early work was all about landscape. But then post 40s, it changes. Look at the Hindi Bhavan, which is such an ambitious project. It looks at the history of India, but not to revive that, but looks at history of India to think about a new India, which will be just at the moment of independence. And he's using that, past, or you might say his personal meditations on the past to really conceptualize a India that can come into existence. So it was always looking at the past to look forward, and not only to the present, but maybe to the immediate future. And this again, you can see, is an interesting thing that Rabindranath brings in, because he wanted to look at the past not to remain there, but to take you forward, to think about the future, rebuild. You can't go back and live in the past, you can't revive it, but you can plan your future. So all these artists did that.
Taking the cue from what you just said before, that most of these artists were also drawing inspirations, mostly conceptual inspirations, and also in terms of different logic of visual language from various cultural sources and art traditions from all over the world, and mainly looking at the East Asian traditions to a great extent. And that also makes many of these artists eclectic in a sense. But the term eclecticism also has produced certain kind of anxiety, not amongst themselves, but later artists and art writers who perhaps misleadingly thought that eclecticism, it's difficult to come out from the eclecticism and one gets lost into it, But you just said just the opposite. No. At least in case of these artists, this has not happened. Now, we also thought that we will talk about in this context two more persons as artists like Ram Kinkar and finally Rabindranath Tagore. So, to what extent this drawing sources and artistic inspirations from different traditions is actually applicable to this idea is applicable to Ram Kinkar, because we also know him as a very instinctual artist driven by impulse. So is Rabindranath. So, what is your take on these two artists, Shivda?
You're right. I mean, the eclecticism actually has different ways of using eclecticism. I mean, I know there is a great criticism about the whole eclecticism being pulling this from here and there and putting it together. This is partly because the origins of eclecticism in classical Western art implies something like that. But the eclecticism as practiced by these artists is not just really pulling something from here, something from there, and putting it all together, making a kind of kichudi of some kind. So the eclecticism of all these people, for instance, Binod Bihari, he draws upon the Ajanta murals on the Mahabalipuram kind of reliefs, on Sotasu, on Persian miniatures, on Giotto, and so on in his Hindi bound mural. But they don't stand out. They are integrated and they become a new language. In visual languages, very often these things can happen. So, eclecticism is a complex thing. Even if they stand out, sometimes it can be very interesting. For instance, David Hockney has shown that you can put two languages which don't mix together and you can make a statement. So, I think you should look at the concept of eclecticism not as a thing on the paper, but you have to look at it as something in operation. How does it happen? What goes together? What doesn't go together? If you don't understand what goes together, then you have a problem. If you know what goes together, it doesn't have a problem. It leads to new possibilities in language. And you can see both these things in art history. Sometimes things which don't go together are put together and that stands out. And sometimes things are taken together and integrated in such a way that it looks like a new, altogether new visual language. Okay, so many of them did this. And when it comes to Ramkinkar, again, he did so many of these things. He really, if you look at the way he draws his watercolors, one is immediately thinks about early modernism. Okay. Now, but at the same time, no modern artist used those lines the way he did, without coming from a background where Eastern calligraphy, especially Chinese, Japanese calligraphic kind of art, was not practiced. One cannot think about using lines in that way. So, if he looked westward, but he also adopted things which really relates to Eastern elements. So, even this division of these artists, the two of them look eastward, two of them look westward, doesn't really kind of hold. Rabindranath, for instance, it is in Japan that he realizes that you need not be realistic in your rendering, that realism and decoration can mix, for instance. Okay, Nandalal realized that looking at Ajanta. He rediscovers it in Japan. Rabindranath first recognizes that in Japan. Okay, but that takes him in another direction, that he need not have to be realistic in rendering. And he noticed how Western artist also learns the same lessons. Then that takes him to the primitive artist. And then it takes him to the modern European artist. So you can see that each one of them would be exploring things, and they find their own ways by also looking at and learning from traditions that may not have originated in India, that might not belong to the same period, but they know what to take from where and how you can put them together and create a new vocabulary. So each one of them did in a different way. Ramkinkar, Binod Bihari, Rabindranath integrated these things a little more because they were not doing art as a pedagogic exercise. Nandalal was doing art both as a self expression as well as a pedagogic exercise. So, in his case, it is not always integrated in the same way, but within each work, you can see how he integrates various things. So, that eclecticism as practiced by the Shantian artist is not a kind of illogical mixing of things. It is a mixing of things which can work together, which can operate together, which can create a new kind of visual vocabulary and language. That is how they did it. And they know how to do that. They don't mix up everything. They don't, Binod Bihari, for instance, doesn't do a figure like Giatos and another figure like Sotasu. He takes the figures of Giotto, which can be compared in some sense to Mahabalipuram, and the rhythmic flow maybe from Ajanta and Mahabalipuram. But at the same time, you can mix that with the spatial abstractions and the twists and turns that Sotasu brings in. Now, you know what to take from where and how to kind of bring them together. So if he tries to do three different kinds of figure drawing, then he might get into trouble. Then they may all stand out. Unless you want to do this, actually, Hockney does two different kinds of figure drawings and put them in the thing to make a particular statement. And he is doing it consciously because it's reflected in the title, A Marriage of Styles. But what Binod Bihari is not doing a marriage of styles, Binod Bihari is taking a certain way of dealing with certain aspects of art and then bringing, sometimes it might be an iconography. Okay, like he takes a horse from Persian painting and puts into his mural. But why does he take that horse? Not because he couldn't draw a horse, but because he understood that the Persians did a kind of horse which is lean, without too many flesh on it. And the figures which he takes from Giotto or the Giotto's thing, but he then puts it into the mold of the Mahabalipuram, which also is a body without too much flesh. So he brings together what can go together. And so that's a very constructive, thoughtful, analytical kind of eclecticism.
In fact, as Manita once said, K.G. Subramanian, that eclecticism might put you into great trouble if it only gets reduced to a stylistic patchwork. This is exactly the term K.G. Subramanian uses. But I also wonder, where does this, opening up oneself as far as these artists are concerned to the world art and also having one's own choices, as you rightly said, people are looking at West as well as East Asian traditions. Within India, there are also certain choices. Binod Bihari looking at Mahabalipuram, but not exactly Hoysala art, things like that. So there are choices also. And at the same time, opening up one's sensibilities to cultures across time and space. I was wondering whether Rabindranath, directly or indirectly, was instrumental in encouraging this approach, this attitude.
Well, he certainly was, involved. As I said, he had what one might, I use the word nudge, which now economists use a lot. He was not maybe the person doing everything, but he was nudging people in certain directions. Okay. Now, but in his own work, we can see he was very clear from the beginning. He might be changing, but with a broader idea which is more or less constant. Right at the beginning of the 20th century, when he talks about art, he says our art hasn't grown into what it should become. And he gives the example of literature that in the late 19th, early 20th century, Bengali literature has moved from being a regional kind of literature into becoming a vehicle for taking the Bengali reader into the world. So your art becomes your vehicle into the larger world. Now that is what he wanted. So if you look at Rabindranath, he had a Swadeshi period, he had a Pan-Asian period, and he had a much more universalist or internationalist period. Now, chronologically, one might even be able to show that. But in each phase, in the Swadeshi period, he's already thinking, well, we have to, find ourselves, but find ourselves so that we can reach out to the world. Asia has to develop its own voice, not to just fight the West, but because again it can reach out to the world. And so he is moving through these phases towards the same one goal that he had right from the beginning. And he was doing various things to encourage his contemporaries and colleagues to do that. He was telling Nandalal all these things about Japan, which he then uses to build his own practice and art education. But at the same time, immediately he's bringing Stella Crambrish and asking her to talk about Western art to Santiniketan artists, and compelling all the Santiniketan artists to go and attend that, and he himself attending it. Okay, so you can see if Nandalal brings Asia onto the table, Rabindranath also gets Stella Crambrish to bring Europe onto the same table. So this is where the interaction. When he went abroad, whether it is Japan or Europe, he was bringing back books and journals and photographs and so on, so that the whole world is available. Each one picked according to his necessity. So if Nandalal looks to Japan or China, or Binod Bihari does that, it doesn't mean that is not being international. It is looking towards other cultures beyond your frame, whether it is to the east or the west. That is an attitude. So, there might be some things that allowed Ramkinkar and Rabindranath in the West that they found to expand their horizons. But there were also people, as I just suggested, who knew about the East and who saw linkages between what was happening in the East and the West. So it was part of a larger program. And as you yourself suggested, they didn't share any style, but they shared these concerns, this larger understanding of art or perspective on art. And that is what made them, kind of a unit of some kind. And that is what Santiniketan stood for. Of course, you might say that, it had evolved again through nationalists. It is responding to nationalist issues, the needs of the nation, if you might say so, needs of India, not in the nation as, because when it started, Indian nation was not there in that sense, not a state as such, but the needs of the new India that is emerging. A lot of work that Nandalal did is in response to what he thought was the needs of this new India, to have a visual culture for that India. Okay, and Ramkinkar, on the other hand, talking about the proletarian people. In a sense, he's also part of that new India, where that new India will include lots of different kinds of people. Binod Bihari's mural is again talking about that new India, where we'll have to look what kind of an India do we want to build. He picks up on the medieval period, the scenes, because it is a more inclusive India that he's talking about. So, in various ways, that all these artists are addressing a common set of problems and issues. Their styles might be different, their emphasis might be different, but that is what they're doing. And Rabindranath himself was doing this through so many different mediums, through literature, through music, through theater, through painting. And his facility in each one of them was slightly different. And the possibility of each one of these art forms were also different. He knew that. So he doesn't try to push the same message through each one of these art forms, but he uses them to create a comprehensive message which he wants to deliver.
Exactly, Shibda. I mean, we can apply the same observation to all these artists because stylistic consistency was something that people usually look up to. And when we look at their entire oeuvre, Nondulal, Ramkinkar, Binod Bihari, we have seen that they have gone through slightly and sometimes more than slightly more pronounced stylistic phases. One person coming up with not necessarily a so called stylistic consistency but stylistic diversity. If it is happening with one individual person, individually, with all of them, so it is quite natural that when we look at the entire Shantiniketan, all these artists, as you have already said, they didn't share similar style, but they shared certain concerns. They and perhaps it is these concerns that hold them together. Now, keeping this observation in mind, is this what we can understand as the total picture of Shantiniketan? So, how do we begin to conceive that, the total picture of Shantiniketan, keeping in mind all the diversities, all the nuances, and all its eclecticisms? Shibda.
Yeah, that's right, Shomik. Actually, if you look carefully, and maybe the clues come, as I suggested, from Rabindranath. He was the one who was, I mean, providing what you might call a master plan for the Shantiniketan project. So he wanted people to respond to the immediate reality, both in terms of environment, of culture, of living experiences, life experiences, and so on. But then it doesn't mean that this has to be identical from individual to individual. And also, it has to remain constant. In one place, Binod Bihari, I saw, had written that tradition is not the repetition of the same thing again and again. Tradition is an ongoing dialogue between individual artists. Tradition is a kind of evolving discourse around certain key issues. Now, if you look at an art movement or an art tradition as something that revolves around a style, then you sort of pin it down to a few physical features. But if you think of it as Binod Bihari did, as a dialogue between different individuals within a common, let us say, climate of culture, then, I mean, we see a different idea of tradition. And what Shantiniketan was something like that. I mean, it was a very engaging dialogue of these artists with their environment and with each other. So there is, each one looking at the other and seeing what is he doing, what is he trying to say, what does it imply, and then responding to it in a certain way according to one's own understanding of these factors. So there was this constant dialogue which you can see between Binod Bihari and Ramkinkar, between Binod Bihari and Nandalal, and between them and Rabindranath going on. So, one thing that I have tried to stress, Rabindranath wanted a new culture to emerge, which is sensitive to the local, sensitive to what is around you. Not because it is in some way national or otherwise, because that's the world in which you live. That's the world which shapes your experiences, because it's a way of connecting with people and place around yourself. So that is what local meant to them. And at the same time, you are not living in a cultural, political cocoon. You are also living in the midst of the world, and especially in the modern period. So that living in the modern times meant that one had to be cosmopolitan. And it is bringing these two things together. So you are rooted where you are, but at the same time, you are open to the rest of the world. This is, I think, what was very important to all these artists and characterizes Shantiniketan.
Perhaps our conversation is coming to an end. So, towards the conclusion of our conversation, and if we may go back to Rabindranath and recall certain arguments, for example, that, well, given this totality, the total picture of Shantiniketan, and also the person who provided, as you said, the master plan to Shantiniketan project, how come Rabindranath himself, as a painter, stands completely apart? Mainly, I'm talking stylistically and also in terms of certain artistic sensibilities from all these major Shantiniketan artists. Is this a valid argument, Shibda?
Yeah, on the face of it, it looks like that, but it is not really absolutely true, because he looks different, he appears different. He obviously knew that he didn't have the skills that the other artists did. So he had to look towards other art traditions where he knew how to become an artist. For him, it was more important to be creative than being Indian or Bengali or kind of thing. That is something will come with it. So in many ways, although he looks like European artist, he's not. For instance, he people compare him with Western expressionist, but he doesn't share their angst. So those stylistic things should not really take, I mean, blind us to other things. And his landscapes are all based on this experience. We who have lived here know that it relates to this place. So I think that explains. So he doesn't stand out actually.
We are coming to an end. Huh? And thank you so much, Shibda, for a very illuminating conversation and your inputs. And this gives us more fodder to think deeply about Shantiniketan artists, the Shantiniketan scenario, not as a monolithic phase in the history of modern art, but as something where a dialogical relationship is still possible, as you suggested. It's not a past, but it's a very living entity to many of us, and possibly it holds a lot of promise for certain future trajectories, not only for the artist of Shantiniketan, but for that matter, anybody. And that is also the reason, and that is what has been felt by even people like Timothy Hyman, for example, coming from a very distant land, but he has felt a great affinity for Shantiniketan. So there are examples which actually prove that particular quality, that streak, which you have been talking about. So once again, thank you, Shibda, and hope that we will have more such conversations in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shomik. It was a great pleasure talking to you. And it was nice discussing these things with you. And I too hope that we'll have other occasions in the future.